I'm Sadie. I'm a senior accountant here at BGO, and this is Braden. He's the managing partner. So I'm just going to get Braden to help me out today. We are doing our audit of a not-for-profit called Accounting Videos for Broke Students, and I have a couple of articling students, and it's their first audit.
Let's go meet the team.
Let's go meet them. Yeah.
Okay, so this is Finn, and this is Jen, and they're our new articling student that are just learning about sampling. And so, what do you guys know about sampling?
I was in Tony Bell's auditing class, and I know all there is to know about auditing. I could probably do this on my own. Braden, you kind of remind me of him, actually.
I don't look like Tony.
Well, I know that the sample needs to be representative of our populations, and we can choose the sample using statistical and non-statistical methods. And statistical is the best for larger populations with a similar transaction, while non-statistical is the best if the population is small and the transactions are not similar. So you can also combine the two and to ensure that you look at the account you historically seen mistakes money in, but I'm not sure what method you refer to use at BGO. I would suggest that we select the sample based on our own judgment.
Well, that's directed sampling. So if we were to use this method, we would look to see about what problems we had with the audit last year, and if there was one, and we would weight our samples more heavily on those items. And another way to do directed sampling is to also lean towards a higher dollar value items.
Or why don't we look at the transactions that occur within the first 10 days of each month?
Well, that's block sampling, and that's just taking a chunk, and we look at the items one block at a time. It's kind of like a biopsy where we take a cross-section of the population and we test that section.
Or we can close our eyes and pick.
Well, that's haphazard sampling. You're trying to randomize, but you aren't really randomizing, and it's unlikely that you would pick the first 5 items on the page that you're selecting the samples from. So all of those methods, those 3 methods that we spoke of, are non-statistical methods, and we tend to call them non-probabilistic methods. And if we use non-probabilistic methods, you try saying probabilistic 3 times.
Probabilistic.
As I was saying, if we use non-probabilistic methods, we cannot say what percentage chance each item has to be selected. And furthermore, by using non-probabilistic methods, we cannot properly estimate the sampling error.
We tend to use statistical methods. That way our sample is chosen randomly and it won't be affected by our biases. However, in not-for-profits, we have to check and see if they've received government grants, and if they have, we have to audit that grant 100%. In not-for-profits, there's also a board of directors who oversee operations and an executive director who manages the entity. We tend to choose larger samples for board of director and executive director accounts because they're more susceptible to fraud. I didn't know that.
Can we do a combination of statistical and non-statistical methods where we use our judgment to group items into categories, and then we use a statistical method to pick a sample from each of those categories?
That would be a stratified method, and it's made up of 2 portions. The non-statistical portion is essentially grouping transactions into categories based on quality, such as dollar amounts. So, like we could group them in tens of thousands of dollars if it's a smaller company, $1 to $10,000, 10 to 20, so on and so forth. And then we use the statistical portion of it is just using random number generators to select samples from each of these chosen groupings. So we use non-probabilistic methods to select the groupings and probabilistic methods to pick the sample itself. But here at BGO, we prefer the statistical methods.
I do too. Tony said that it's always best to use statistical methods. That way, our sample can be quantified by mathematical modeling.
Is that a direct quote?
So with the statistical method do you refer, I heard of simple randoms, systematics, and monitoring unit.
Oh, let me show you.
I asked him to help me teach them about sampling. I didn't ask for a lesson.
Okay, so the easiest method is simple random, and that's pretty much just using a random number generator to pick numbers from these accounts here and then use those in our samples. The second method is systematic. So let's say we have these 12 items and we want 3 samples. That means we need to pick every 4th item. And it's random in the sense that we would put the first 4 items in a random number generator, and it would generate a number in which one to start with. So let's say we started with 2, which is Sterling Stairs. We'd pick every 4th item after this. So we'd go 1, 2, 3, 4. We'd pick Queenie's Quills. We'd go 1, 2, 3, 4. We'd pick Liam's Lux. And that gives us 3 samples. And the last one, which is my personal favorite, is monetary. Oops, how did that happen? Anyway, monetary units. And that's because I like big numbers.
Kind of funny, but that's Tony's favorite too. Like, come on.
So the last method is the monetary method. And in this one, we use the accumulated values. So the accumulated value here is $70,000. And let's say we want 3 samples again. So we take the accumulated value and divide it by the number of samples that we want, and it'll give us an increment. So in this case, it's 23,333. Now, we use a random number generator to generate a number between 1 and 23,333, and that's the number that we're going to start at. So let's say, for example, our random number generator gave us $10,000. So we would look at the account that is over 10,000. So accumulated, it's not at 10,000 here or here, but it is here. So our first item that we pick from our accounts is Bevan's Beer. And then, I'll pull out my handy dandy calculator, we would choose the next one, so 11,000 plus our increment, 23,333, to give us our next one. So $34,333 is where the next one has to be. So it's not at 19,000, not 21,000, but it's not 26,000, but here at Amon's Acorn. So this would be the second sample we pick. And the third one, we just add another 23,333, gives us 57,666, which is not here, it's not here, but it's here at Shine Chandelier. And the thing to note about monetary unit is it's more likely that you're going to get the bigger values. And as you can see, our sample for Shine Chandelier is 15,000, and also Amon's Acorn, which is at 10,000, was included in our sample. And these two are actually the biggest amounts on this list. So those are the 3 sampling methods. So Jen, why don't you come up and explain the different kinds of tests that we do?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. So there's two kinds of tests that we're going to do. One will be the test of controls, and one will be the substantive tests. So first we'll look at the test of controls, and they will help us determine if the controls in the company are reliable or not. So the first step is to determine if sampling actually applies, which it probably will in this case. And then we're going to define the population characteristics. So we're going to define the population, the sampling unit, and the control deviation. Then we're going to apply our statistical or non-statistical sampling, which is what we talked about earlier, of course. And then we're going to determine our sample size. And our sample size for our test of control is determined by the risk of incorrect acceptance, the tolerable deviation rate, and the expected population deviation rate.
Could you explain those in further detail?
Okay, so the risk of incorrect acceptance is the risk that we will accept a control as it's reliable when it actually isn't. The tolerable deviation rate is the exception that we would make, or allow rather, within the population while still claiming the controls are effective. The expected population deviation rate is the rate that we would expect to differ prior to doing any testing. So then the next part is that we would select our sample items, which again we had seen prior to, and then we would perform our audit procedures. So in this case here, we would understand and investigate any of the deviations observed. We would then evaluate our sample results, and this would include calculating the sample deviation rate and the upper deviation rate. And then we would make our conclusions. And our conclusions will include whether or not the controls are reliable and whether or not we need to modify our substantive tests. Okay, so the next kind of test we're going to do is substantive tests of details. And first we're going to see if sampling applies, much like the tests of control. We're also going to define population characteristics. The difference is that we're going to define a misstatement. And then we're going to apply statistical or non-statistical sampling. And then we're going to determine the sample size. So our sample size for substantive testing is determined by our desired risk of incorrect acceptance, which is the risk that we accept errors when we shouldn't. Tolerable misstatements, which is the acceptable errors, expected population misstatements, which is the errors we expect to see in our population, and the population size in dollars. From there, we're going to select our sample items, and then we're going to perform our audit procedures. So, much like the test of controls, we're going to have to understand and investigate observed misstatements. The difference in here is that we can ask the client to correct known misstatements, or we can further investigate them. So from there, we're going to evaluate our sample results. And in this case, we would calculate the projected misstatement and the upper limit on misstatement. So the projected misstatement is what we take our sampling and depending on the errors that we find in our samples, we project it onto the population. So an example of this would be if we observe 2 errors in a sample of 10, we could determine that our population has a 20% error rate, and we can draw conclusions based on that. So our conclusion is to determine whether population is acceptable or not.
Can you elaborate on the projected misstatement by using numbers?
Oh, yeah. So if we have 2 errors, one error that has $1,000 and another error of $3,000, and out of our 10 samples that we took and our population is 100, what we would do is we would take the total errors, which is $4,000, and multiply it by 10, which would end up with $40,000 in a projected misstatement. Yeah. So then back into where I was going with this, our results from each of the testing will give us insight on how to change our audit plan and provide us with recommendations to management.
Good work, Jen. It's clear that you were paying attention in your audit class. In regards to not-for-profits, we specifically look at 3 common risk factors. They are management override, fraud, and lack of segregation of duties. Often in small not-for-profits, you have a problem with your segregation of duties because you have very few employees. And then we also need to get external confirmation for government grants given to not-for-profits.
Okay, so we want to know how managers can override the system and what controls are in place for that system override. We pretty much want to make sure that the managers aren't overriding the system for personal gains or for unethical reasons. And we want to focus on fraud because fraud is a serious crime and we need to take extra steps and precautions if we believe that a fraud has been committed because it's a very serious accusation if we're accusing the client of fraud. And since, as Sadie mentioned, not-for-profits can be small, it's important to look at segregation of duties because sometimes a not-for-profit will have 1 or 2 people doing all the work and we must be aware of that. So this increases our risk, which means that we must increase our testing to counteract that risk.
All right, thank you, Braden, for helping me brief the newbies on sampling. You can get out of here. We're going to get some work done. All right.
Yeah.
Or why don't we just look at transactions in the last 10, damn it. Or why don't we just look at transactions in the
You can also use
Isn't it awkward?
Generators to select samples from each of their chosen groupings. So we use non-probabilistic methods to select the group.
Oh, let me show you. Oh, let me show you. That was worse.